I never thought I'd become the kind of man who takes the law into his own hands. I've spent 31 years believing in the system, paying my taxes, trusting that if something went wrong, the right people would fix it. Then I came home 4 days early from a work rotation in northern Alberta, and everything I believed turned out to be a story I'd been telling myself so I could sleep at night. My name is Paul Whitfield. I'm a pipe fitter. I work 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off at a natural gas processing facility outside of Fort McMurray. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well, and it kept my daughter in dance lessons and hockey camp for most of her childhood. After my wife and I divorced 6 years ago, the money mattered even more. It was the one concrete thing I could do for my daughter from 800 kilometers away. My daughter is Caitlin. She's 11 years old. She has her mother's stubborn streak and my terrible sense of direction, and she names every living thing she comes across. Last spring, she named a spider that lived in the bathroom window Harold. She cried for a week when he disappeared. My ex-wife, Adrian, remarried 2 years ago. His name is Wade Coulter. I know that name because I've had to write it on legal documents, say it to police officers, repeat it to child protection workers, until it lost all meaning and became just a sound. Wade Coulter, personal fitness coach out of Barrie, Ontario. Good-looking in the way that makes you trust someone before you should. The kind of man who remembers your coffee order the first time and never lets you forget he remembered it. I had reservations about him from the first time Caitlin mentioned him. Not anything I could name. She said he was okay, said he was funny sometimes, said he bought her a new pair of figure skates for Christmas. I told myself I was being a bitter ex-husband reading into things. First mistake I ever made in my life that I'm genuinely ashamed of. The rotation I was on was supposed to run until the Thursday. A pressure valve failure in one of the secondary processing lines shut the whole facility down on Sunday morning. Site manager sent us home with a day's pay and told us not to come back until the maintenance crew signed off. I didn't call Adrian. I figured I'd surprise Caitlin, take her for breakfast at that diner she likes on Dunlop Street, the one with the mismatched chairs and the blueberry pancakes she always orders, even though she pretends to look at the menu. I pulled into Barrie around 7 in the morning. The neighborhood was quiet the way Sunday mornings are quiet in small Ontario cities, that heavy stillness before church is let out. Adrian's car was in the driveway. Wade's truck was there too. I knocked. Nobody answered. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. My chest did something then that I don't have a word for. Not quite fear, more like recognition. The way you recognize a wrong note in a song you've heard 100 times. I went around the side of the house, through the gate. The backyard was big for the neighborhood. Adrian had been proud of that when they bought the place. There was a garden shed along the back fence, one of those plastic storage sheds, maybe 6 by 8 feet, that they sold at Canadian Tire, the kind people use for lawnmowers and garden hoses. The crying was coming from inside it. I ran. I don't remember deciding to run. My legs just moved. The door had a latch on the outside with a padlock through it. The crying stopped when my footsteps hit the patio stones. "Caitlin," I said. My voice came out strange, like it belonged to someone else. Silence. Then, "Dad?" A sound like that does something to you that nothing can undo afterward. I heard my daughter's voice through a plastic door at 7 in the morning, and something in me broke open that has never fully closed again. I grabbed a garden stake from the flower bed along the fence and worked it through the padlock loop and levered until the latch housing ripped free of the door. The door swung open. The smell came first. She'd been using a plastic bin in the corner as a toilet. The shed had no ventilation to speak of, and it was a cool enough morning that I could see her breath, which meant it had been cold inside overnight. She was sitting in the corner with her knees pulled up to her chest, still in her pajamas. Pink ones with polar bears on them that she'd had since she was 8 and refused to throw out because she said they were still perfectly good. Her face was streaked with old dried tears and new ones. Her lips were chapped. When she saw me, she made a sound I can't describe and threw herself at me so hard she knocked me back a step. I held her. I didn't say anything for a while. I just held her. When I could speak again, I asked her how long. "Since Friday after supper," she said. Her voice was hoarse. It was Sunday morning. 36 hours. 36 hours my daughter had been locked in a garden shed in the backyard of the house, where she was supposed to be safe. I carried her inside. The back door was unlocked. Adrian was in the living room. She was awake, sitting on the couch with a mug of coffee, and when she saw us, her face did something I will never be able to explain. It wasn't surprise. It was the face of someone who'd been dreading a specific thing and had just watched it arrive. "You knew," I said. "Paul, you knew she was out there." She started crying. Told me she'd thought it would just be a few hours Friday night. that Caitlin had back-talked Wade at dinner, that he'd said she needed to think about her attitude somewhere quiet, and Adrian had thought. She kept using that word, thought, like thinking it had made it real. She'd thought he meant an hour, maybe 2. Then she'd taken some Ativan and gone to bed, and when she woke up Saturday, The crying got worse here. She'd gone to the shed, and Caitlin had begged to come in, and Wade had said she wasn't ready yet, and Adrian had. She'd gone back inside. My daughter spent another night in a plastic shed in October in Barrie, Ontario, while her mother took her anxiety medication and watched television. I set Caitlin on the kitchen counter and got her water. She drank 3 glasses without stopping. I got her crackers from the cupboard. I checked her hands, her arms. No injuries I could see. Her feet were bare and cold. I wrapped them in a dish towel while she ate. Then I looked at Wade, who had come downstairs sometime during all of this and was standing in the doorway to the kitchen in track pants and a Lululemon hoodie, arms crossed, with an expression on his face that I can only describe as inconvenienced. "I'm calling the police," I told him. He told me I was overreacting. He said Caitlin had a behavior problem I'd never had to deal with because I wasn't around enough to see it. He said sometimes kids needed a hard reset, and he knew what he was talking about because he'd worked with youth athletic programs for years and there was a method to it. I called 911. The OPP arrived in 11 minutes. Paramedics came 6 minutes after that and took Caitlin to Royal Victoria Regional Health Center for assessment. I rode with her. In the ambulance, she fell asleep holding my hand, and I watched her chest rise and fall, and thought about all the weekends I'd driven back to Fort McMurray thinking she was safe. At the hospital, they treated her for mild dehydration and mild hypothermia. The doctor, who assessed her, was a quiet woman who wrote things down methodically and didn't look up from her clipboard when she told me that Caitlin had bruising on her upper arms consistent with being gripped hard, and that this would be documented in the report to Children's Aid. I went into the hallway and stood there for a few minutes. A hospital hallway in the early morning has its own particular silence. I stood in it and understood for the first time that I was going to have to make some choices. Wade was arrested that afternoon, charged with forcible confinement and child endangerment. Adrian was interviewed but not arrested, which the detective explained to me very carefully, using words I understood individually, but which didn't add up to anything I could accept. Aware of, but not perpetrating. Bystander status pending further review. They were looking at a possible charge of failure to provide the necessaries of life, but it wasn't certain yet. Wade was taken before a justice of the peace the next morning. His lawyer, and he had a very good lawyer, the kind with a downtown Barrie office and a website with a professional headshot, argued for release on conditions. No criminal record, strong community ties, long-standing professional reputation. The justice released him on a $15,000 recognizance with a no-contact order with Caitlin. He was out by noon. Caitlin was still in hospital. I sat in the family lounge for a while, after the detective called to tell me. I looked at the wall. I thought about the no-contact order, about what it meant, about what it didn't mean. It meant Wade couldn't approach Caitlin. It meant he was still in his house. It meant he was sleeping in his bed while my daughter was in a hospital gown asking the nurses if they had any books she could read, because she was bored, and bored meant she was starting to feel like herself again, and that was the only thing that got me through that afternoon. Caitlin was discharged on Tuesday. She came to stay with me at my sister's house in Innisfil, where I'd been crashing since I couldn't afford a hotel for an indefinite stretch. My sister had 3 dogs and a pull-out couch and made French-Canadian pea soup from scratch when someone was hurting, and by Wednesday Caitlin had named all 3 dogs after Canadian prime ministers and was teaching the youngest one to shake paws. She slept with the light on. She woke up twice the first night, making sounds I'd never heard from her before. She apologized for it in the morning. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. She asked me once, quietly, while we were watching hockey, on Thursday evening, whether Wade was going to go to jail. I told her the truth. I said I didn't know. I said the police were working on it. She nodded and went back to watching the game and didn't say anything else, but I saw what happened in her face before she looked away. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks out. The Crown Attorney called me to talk through the case. She was competent and matter-of-fact and told me the evidence was solid, but that first-time offenses in cases without physical assault convictions typically resulted in plea arrangements, conditional sentences, probation with mandatory counseling, community service hours. I asked her what that looked like in practice. House arrest, she said, electronic monitoring, possibly 12 to 18 months of supervised probation. For locking my daughter in a shed for 36 hours in October. I thanked her and hung up and drove out to the Innisfil waterfront and sat on a picnic table in the cold for about an hour. Then I drove back to my sister's and helped Caitlin with her science homework and made pasta carbonara for dinner because she said it was her favorite, and I realized I hadn't known that and wanted to start knowing everything I'd missed. That night I found Wade's Instagram. He'd gone private, but some of his older posts were still visible through a shared tag on a local fitness expo page. He'd posted to story. Couldn't see it, but the thumbnail showed him at what looked like a coffee shop, looking relaxed. Someone had tagged him in a comment. "Stay strong, brother. You've got people in your corner." The people in his corner were strangers on the internet. The people in Caitlin's corner were me, my sister, and 3 dogs named after dead prime ministers. I started paying attention to Wade's routine the way you pay attention to things at the plant. Not with anger, but with the particular flat focus of a man who understands that in pressurized systems, patience is what keeps you alive. He was back at the gym inside a week. His studio was in a strip mall on Bayfield Street, the kind with a Shoppers Drug Mart at one end and a vacant unit at the other. He trained clients in the evenings mostly. Tuesdays and Thursdays he was there until 9, Friday nights until 9:30, sometimes 10. I rented a half-ton from Enterprise under a legitimate booking, paid with my debit card, told myself I was just watching. I told myself a lot of things in those 2 weeks that I knew weren't true. Friday night, October. Cold enough that my breath fogged the windshield while I waited. He came out at 9:45 with his gym bag over one shoulder, scrolling his phone. The parking lot was mostly empty. I got out of the truck. He heard me and looked up. His whole body changed. Something behind his eyes went flat. "You're not supposed to be near me," he said. "The order protects Caitlin from you," I said. "Nothing in there about you and me." He said his lawyer had advised him not to talk to me. I said his lawyer wasn't there. He started to say something else, and I took one step toward him, and whatever he was going to say stopped in his mouth. "I want you to understand," I told him, "that what you did to my daughter wasn't discipline. It wasn't a method. It was cruelty. And I want you to understand that before any court gets near you, you're going to understand that from the inside." He ran. Not for the street, for the back of the parking lot, toward the service alley. Wade Coulter trained people for a living. He was probably faster than me on a treadmill. He was not faster than a man who had been running from things he couldn't fix for 11 years and had finally stopped running. I caught him at the dumpsters at the end of the alley. I had a taser I'd bought from a classified ad, legal in Ontario for self-defense, though what I was planning was considerably beyond self-defense. I used it. He went down. I got him into the truck. I drove 40 minutes north to a rural property my cousin owns outside of Midland. He uses it for deer hunting season, and the rest of the time it sits empty. There's an old cement block equipment shed at the back of the property, maybe 10 by 12 feet, no windows, one ventilated gap near the roof line, a steel door with an exterior latch. I'd been there 2 days earlier. I'd left a blanket on the floor because whatever I was doing, I wasn't doing what he'd done. I left a 2-liter bottle of water. I left 2 granola bars. I left a bucket. He was conscious when I walked him in. His eyes were wild. He tried to talk, and I let him talk. When he ran out of things to say, I spoke. 36 hours, I told him. Starting now. Every few hours, I'm going to come back, and I'm going to tell you what Caitlin was doing at this point in her 36 hours. And you're going to sit here and think about whether that was a method. I closed the door. I drove to my cousin's hunting cabin and sat in the dark and thought about what I'd done. Hour 1. I came back. Told him Caitlin had been crying and asking to be let out, and that nobody had answered. He pounded on the door. I told him she'd done the same thing. Hour 6. He'd stopped pounding. I told him that at hour 6, Caitlin had stopped calling for her mother and started talking to herself quietly to stay calm. She'd told the child psychologist this later. I told Wade this through the ventilation gap. Hour 12. He was asking to negotiate, telling me he'd plead guilty, serve whatever the court decided, never go near Caitlin again. I told him that at hour 12, Caitlin had stopped talking to herself and just sat in the corner with her knees up, trying not to fall asleep because she'd been afraid of what would happen if she slept. I almost can't write this next part. Hour 24. When I opened the ventilation gap, the shed was quiet. He'd stopped asking. He was sitting in the corner with his knees up, the same position. I told him that. I said, "That's what you looked like. That's what you made my 11-year-old daughter look like." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, I know what I did." I told him he had 12 hours left. At hour 36, I opened the door. He was a different person than the man I'd put in there. I won't describe it beyond that. He'd drunk the water. He hadn't touched the food. I'd left my phone recording inside the ventilation gap for the last 6 hours. I did this deliberately. In those 6 hours, Wade Coulter talked to himself the way a man talks when he believes no one is listening. He talked about what he'd done to Caitlin. He talked about other things too. Shorter incidents. Weekends when Adrian had been visiting her sister that he'd told Caitlin were just between them. He talked about his own father and what his father had done and how he'd promised himself he'd be different, and clearly he hadn't been. He talked about Caitlin's rabbit. Her rabbit. I hadn't known about the rabbit. She'd stopped mentioning it months ago, and I'd assumed she'd lost interest. His name, she'd told him, was Biscuit. Wade had put the rabbit in the garage. I won't finish that sentence. I called 911 from a prepaid phone, told the dispatcher there was a man on the Midland Side property who needed medical attention. Left the address. Drove back to Innisfil in the dark and burned the prepaid phone in my cousin's fire pit on the way. The OPP found Wade. He was treated at Georgian Bay General Hospital for dehydration and mild exposure. He told them what had happened to him. He told them it was me. The detective who caught the file called me in for questioning and asked me directly, across a table in the Barrie detachment, whether I'd had any contact with Wade Coulter in the previous 48 hours. I told him I'd been at my sister's house in Innisfil. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "The recording we found at the scene is going to be admissible because the person who made it didn't break any applicable provincial statute in recording a confession from a private individual in a private space. He wasn't under arrest. Nobody held a weapon to his head while he spoke. He just talked." He said this to the table, mostly. Then he looked at me again. He said, "I have a daughter too." That was all. Wade Coulter pleaded guilty to 2 counts of forcible confinement, 1 count of child endangerment, and 1 count of criminal negligence causing harm to an animal. His own recorded voice made the trial unnecessary. He received 4 years in provincial custody, the maximum his lawyer had managed to negotiate down to, which still felt like a number drawn from somewhere that had nothing to do with 36 hours in the cold and a rabbit named Biscuit. Adrian was charged with failure to provide the necessaries of life. She pleaded guilty, received a conditional sentence, 12 months house arrest, mandatory counseling, and a 2-year supervised probation period. Children's Aid placed Caitlin with me full-time immediately. Adrian has supervised visits now, monthly, at a family services center in Barrie. She shows up every time. She's been sober for 5 months. I watch her hug Caitlin carefully, like she knows she's handling something she almost let break, and I don't know what I feel. Something complicated that I don't have the right vocabulary for yet. Caitlin sees a therapist twice a week in Barrie. Her name is Dr. Patricia Fournier, and she has a dog named Gerald who lies in the corner during sessions. Caitlin told me she talks to Gerald when the words get stuck. I think that's the most sensible therapy approach I've ever heard of. She's sleeping through the night now, mostly. She went back to skating. Last month, she landed a sit spin for the first time, and I watched it from the boards and had to pretend I was looking at my phone so she wouldn't see me crying. She doesn't talk about Wade much. Once, about 3 months after everything, she asked me if I'd done something. "Not for the court," she said. "Something else." I looked at her the way I always try to look at her, straight on. "I made sure he understood what he did to you," I said. "I made sure he felt it." She thought about this. She has a habit, when she's thinking, of pressing her lips together and looking slightly to the left of whatever she's actually considering, as though the real question is hovering somewhere just past the thing she asked. "Good," she said finally, and she went back to the game on the television. I haven't told this story to anyone except in fragments to my therapist, who says I'm dealing with what she calls moral injury. The harm that comes from crossing your own ethical lines, even in defense of something you'd cross any line for. She says it's common in first responders, in veterans, in people who've had to make choices that don't fit into any of the categories they grew up with. I wasn't at war. I was in a strip mall parking lot in Barrie on a Friday night, deciding who I was willing to become for my daughter. I'm still not sure if I made the right choice. I think about it most nights. I think about the cement block shed and the ventilation gap, and the sound of a grown man talking to himself in the dark after 28 hours alone. I think about whether that makes me different from him, or just a different version of the same thing. And then I think about Caitlin landing that sit spin, looking up from the ice to see if I was watching. I was watching. I'm always watching now. That's the one thing I got right. I'm here, I'm paying attention, and she knows it. She wrote something in art class last month, a piece her teacher asked her to share with the class on the theme of resilience. She read it out loud. I found out about it afterward from her teacher, who called me, I think because she wanted me to hear it. she said. "I was in the dark once and I thought I would stay there, but my dad came and took the door off. That's what dads are supposed to do. The door is gone now and I'm not going back in." 9 words about a door, and I haven't been able to get them out of my head since. I'm not going to tell you to do what I did. I'm not going to give you a roadmap for breaking the law in the name of justice, because I don't believe that's something one person should hand another. What I will tell you is this: trust the feeling in your chest when something is wrong. Don't let anyone tell you that trusting that feeling is overreacting. Don't let good manners or fear of conflict or faith in a process keep you from walking around the side of a house to check on your kid. The system eventually worked in this case. Eventually. With evidence. With a confession made inside a shed to nobody in particular. Whether it would have worked without that, I'll never know. What I know is that Caitlin is safe. What I know is that she reads before bed now without the light on. What I know is that she named the fish she got for her birthday Biscuit Jr. because she said Biscuit deserved to be remembered. She's not wrong. She's almost never wrong. I came home early from Fort McMurray on a Sunday morning thinking I'd take my daughter for blueberry pancakes. I came home to something I couldn't have imagined, and I made choices I can't unmake, and somewhere on the other side of all of it, there's a girl on the ice landing a sit-spin and looking up to see if her dad is still there. I'm still there. That part I'm sure of.